Alrighty. I have one last question. Let's say we change that if to a while. Does anybody know what would happen? Or rather, okay. Yeah, what do y'all think would happen? Somebody can speak up in chat. Yeah. What if I changed it to that? What would happen? That's right, Raymond. It would never run, so the alert wouldn't even go once. Cool. Alrighty, so we're going to be talking about jQuery. Does anybody have any? Can I get like B's and P's if anyone knows what jQuery is? All right, so it's kind of mixed. So jQuery is a JavaScript library. Sometimes the native methods to manipulate the DOM that we've been using, like query selector, text content, they're just not very convenient, right? They're long names, and sometimes they're a little bit awkward. And so jQuery originally started out as an open source project, open source library to give you kind of an easier shorthand to manipulate the DOM. And that was in 2005. And since then, it's actually become one of the largest open source projects on the web. There's lots of contributors. There's a whole ecosystem of plugins, third-party plugins that developers have made. There's a bunch of spin-offs. jQuery has its own foundation that kind of maintains and updates jQuery, and it also has a lot of other functionality outside of manipulating the DOM. Today, we're just going to be looking at manipulating the DOM. Later in the course, we will be using it for some other stuff, like we'll be making AJAX requests, which is how you talk to another site and ask it for information. All right, so I've built kind of I've built a simple HTML page right here. And I've included jQuery on the page in a script tag. This link is called a CDN link. That stands for Content Distribution Network. Let's see, where did my Chrome window go? So when you want to include it on the page, there's two ways to link to it. You can download your own local version from jQuery's website, but you can also go find one of these CDN links, and there's probably a bunch of them online. I think the one that I have on there right now comes from the Google developers website. So that's the link that I'm using. Oh, wait, that's the Angular. Where's the jQuery? Let's see. Okay, so jQuery has also its own CDN link. So you can just right-click and copy link address and link it onto the page. So that's how you get it on there. Now the question is, what does jQuery do? What's it useful for? All right, so this is the index. Ooh, hold on, let me reload this. All right, cool. So right now I have that HTML page that I defined earlier open. I've got several divs on here, but right now they're hidden. And those divs have the class of content, and they each have their own separate ID. Additionally, the main div that's the container has the ID of main. So in my console, I can use jQuery to grab each of those HTML tags. The way that jQuery is accessible on the page is as the $sign. All of the jQuery functions are saved into a JavaScript object that's set to this variable $sign. So I'll say $sign, and it's a function. And then I have to pass in, something in to target the HTML tags. And in jQuery, you target the tags in the same way you would with CSS. So you stringify the selector. And then let's say I wanted to grab all of those divs that have a class of content. I would say dot content. And it just gave me all 5 of those divs. You can see they're invisible back there. And let's say that I just wanted to target one of them. I can also use IDs like I would in CSS. We'll grab number 1. Cool. And you can also just target HTML tags. So there's a single H1 on the page. So I'll grab that. Cool. It just gave me that H1 up there. Now this isn't very useful yet. We're just grabbing the elements. We're not doing anything with them. But jQuery offers you a lot of conveniences to be able to change and manipulate them. First off, you can add CSS to them. So let's make that div with the ID of 1 have a background color of red. So you'll say 1.css, and the first argument that you pass to this function is the property you want to change, and the second is the value you want to give that CSS property. Cool. That's got a background of red. You can also add classes, and I've got some predefined classes over here. I'm sorry, not classes. Yeah, classes and IDs. So let's grab all of the content divs, and we will add class of primary. Cool. And you can see when I used that .css on the one with the ID of 1, it added it as an inline style, which takes precedent over classes in your style sheet. So that one stays red, even though it has a class of primary to it. We can also remove classes. And we can toggle classes. And there's actually a few other ways to access this. And that's one thing that you'll find about jQuery, is that there's kind of a bunch of different ways to do any given thing that you want to do on a page. And it's really just up to you and your stylistic preferences as a developer, which one you want to choose. So for instance, if I wanted to add a new square to the page, I'll target my main div that contains all of my squares. And I can say dot append. And so this is going to be appending it to the main square. And I can pass it HTML. And it's added another square. But in the reverse, I can also I can use a function called append to. And the syntax would be reversed if I did that. So let's store that HTML in a variable. And so we've got this variable called square. And I'll pass square into jQuery. And I'll say append to the main div. Before I keep moving, I do want to, let's see if there's any questions. Okay.
Did anybody else try and hop in for a question or no? Okay.
Oh, yeah, there's none in the chat, but you can ask a question.
Yeah, I didn't know. My internet kept cutting out, so at the beginning, I missed how you got. Oh, you're in developer tools. Okay, I didn't know if there was something that you told everybody to do or not. So I was.
No, I've got an HTML page set up back here.
Oh yeah, okay.
The browser, and I've just been manipulating it.
Oh, okay.
The tools, but that does bring me to another good point. Is that right now I've just been doing all these in my console, and as soon as I refresh the page, all of those changes disappear. So when you want to make something more permanent, you can either write it in a script tag on your page, or you can write it in a separate script tag. I'll do it actually on the page right now. And you see when I open this script tag, I use something called document.ready. That's a jQuery thing that makes sure that whatever manipulations you're doing on the page don't happen until everything's loaded. So if you tried to run some JavaScript before that targeted the content divs before all the content divs had loaded, you might get an error back and it wouldn't work because it would be like, hey, I can't find this thing that you're referencing. So by wrapping everything in document.ready, you make sure that it's all loaded on the page. I think that whenever I load my page, I want to go ahead and...
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, does it mean that everything has to be written inside the document.ready function? I mean, everything that needs to be loaded, inside the page load. Does it need to be inside this document.ready function inside the script tag?
So any script that's going to run by itself, you do need to wrap in document.ready. Any jQuery script that you're going to run that's just going to run immediately when the page loads, you do. But there's also, and I'll get into event handlers very briefly. So there's things you can use to handle user interaction on the page. And because that can happen, that really won't happen until the user starts interacting with the page. You don't necessarily have to wrap those in document.ready, but it is best practice to do that way.
Hey, Zan.
Yeah.
So when you style something using jQuery, is that considered inline, and does that take precedence over CSS style sheet?
That's a good question. When you use the .css, so if I target .content and then I say .css, that will make it an inline style. And it'll add it to that div as an inline style. But if you add class or remove class or toggle class, if you do anything like that, it's just adding the class it's adding a class that will only have effect if you have that class defined in your style sheet.
Okay, thanks.
Just as a question for best practice, do you usually use classes, or actually pushing a button and everything should change to make the classes first, and then you say, okay, when somebody hits the button, jQuery does the remainder, or do you work with inline styles to override?
I would say it's best practice to, if you are going to be changing classes if you're going to be changing styles on the page, it's better to add and remove classes rather than adding and removing inline styles. And that's also just easier to work with. Like it's a much cleaner syntax to be able to say like add class centered instead of having to say like .css, .css margin, and then giving it the correct margin, and then having to do like another one that's .css height, and then another one for .css width. So it's just kind of easier to work with classes and predefine them in your style sheet.
Aizan,
Yeah.
just a kind of funny question. How do we know when to use jQuery or just a normal JavaScript, file or?
I don't know if there's any like hard set rule about that. It really depends on what you're trying to do. I think jQuery is primarily used for making pages interactive, so you can add, you can add animations as people move around the page. I've got some buttons up here that I'm going to talk about in a minute, where you can add handlers for when they click something, like an event happens when they click something or when they submit a form. So it really depends on what you want to do, and if there's a good jQuery way to use it, or even if you're using jQuery. As you get further on, you might be using another JavaScript framework besides jQuery that takes care of everything that jQuery would do.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's see. All right, so back to document.ready. Inside of that, you can write pieces of script that will happen whenever the page loads. So now, when I load that page, it's just going to go ahead and add that class. You can also you can chain jQuery methods together. So, oh wait, I didn't. 1 second.
So, does it mean that, when you put these squares, it reminds me that of these widgets that we used to see on website, on modern website. So those are done using jQuery?
It kind of depends. A lot of websites use jQuery, but then there's also, this was kind of one of the originals and is a really big piece of the internet still. But there's also other JavaScript frameworks, and a lot of the time, you won't want to use two frameworks at once, because when we're working with the DOM, the document object model, it's a JavaScript representation of the page, and each of these libraries has their own way of kind of monitoring that JavaScript data and then re-rendering it into the browser. And so they kind of like, sometimes they'll fight each other. So for instance, if somebody is building something with the JavaScript framework Angular, they'll use Angular methods instead of jQuery methods. But maybe they're just using jQuery instead of Angular, and so they're just going to use jQuery. That again, though, there's not really a hard and fast rule for that. Sometimes it makes sense to use both of those together. Let's see. There's a method called Detach for removing elements from the page, and I'm going to do that right now because I want to store some elements. All right, I'm gonna grab all of these divs. And I'm going to store them as group of divs. So they all disappeared, but I have them stored in this variable called group of divs. And since they're JavaScript, they're available as a group, and I can access them the way I would usually with JavaScript. Oh, oops. Then I'm going to have to copy this. Let's see. So I'm gonna, so I've got a while loop here, and I've got right now I is equal to 0, and at each iteration of the while loop, it's gonna grab one of my divs, and it's gonna set the HTML inside that div equal to a header tag, and then it's gonna append that new div to the page, and then it's gonna increment I. Oh, so they all showed up as just the letter I. What's happening? Well, we've stringified I. So another important point is that, let me set I back to 0. Another important point is that when you're writing these strings of HTML, you can mix in unstringified stuff. So this I now is actually going to be a number that's counting up. Cool. So now they all have a number.
Just a quick one.
Yeah.
I just saw where you used the hashtag to on the main, the hash
Yeah.
for you to grab the main. And when you are trying to grab the div content, you didn't use the hash. So where does hash is used and where does it not used?
Okay. So the hash, when I'm using the hashtag to access things, that's when they have an ID. So if this has an ID of main, then I would say, with my jQuery, I would say hashtag main. But each of these divs has a class of content. So I can grab all of those divs by saying dot content. It works the same way as when you're writing CSS. And again, I can also, I don't even have to pass a class or an ID. I can access it using just the name of the HTML tag. And I'll touch on one more thing is event handlers. So I have these buttons up here, and I want to write something that will make the page react when a button gets clicked. And I know some of this I'm moving a little bit quickly, but I think as you get into it, an important lesson to learn while you're learning jQuery is how to read through the documentation and how to kind of figure out the questions using jQuery's documentation. It's a good place to start because jQuery has very thorough documentation, and basically anything you want to do, they probably have some version of how to do it. So the let's see, event handlers are ways to make a script that's going to happen when a user interacts with a page in a certain way. So I'm targeting the button that has the ID show divs, and I say on click. So when that gets clicked, and then I'm passing, if you look where the parentheses are, this is a second argument to the .on method. I'm passing a function into there, and that function is going to toggle the class primary whenever I click that button. Now that button actually does something. And with a lot of those event handlers, there's alternative syntax. I could, instead of saying on click, I could just say dot click and get rid of that part of it. And now it'll do the same thing. And again, basically for whatever you want to do, like if I wanted to make a handler that made something happen just when they hover over it, or if I wanted to make a handler that does something when the person clicks enter when they're trying to submit a form, there's different jQuery methods for each of those things, and I would encourage you to dive into the documentation and don't be afraid to find out new stuff about it. So yeah, that is the end of the presentation. Do I have any more questions before we finish up and send you off to do exercises?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Again, in terms of best practice or even just how it should be used, at the bottom where you call the document and ready to make sure nothing loads or everything loads first before you run the jQuery, does your entire code supposed to run within the curly brackets then?
Yes. So what's happening there is that it's targeting document, which is an object, and that object sends an event. It kind of sends the signal when it's done loading, and behind the scenes it tells jQuery, "Hey, I'm done loading. I'm ready." It sends. There's actually another way to write this. It's working the same as the click handler. You can say on, and you can pass ready into there, and it's sending this ready event when it's done loading everything. Does that answer your question?
It does. I was just mostly curious if this is where typically you'll be putting your code within this the curly brackets of this document object.
Yeah, I would say whenever you're doing DOM stuff, you're doing event handlers or doing any kind of animations, you'll want to put it inside of document.ready. There's some other more advanced uses for jQuery that you don't necessarily need this for, but they don't have anything to do with manipulating the DOM. So yeah, for right now, just keep everything inside of there to be safe.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Alrighty. Do we have any other questions?
What does toggle class do?
Oh, so toggle class essentially adds and removes the class. So when our page loads, the class primary is added to each of the squares. And when I click that button, it's going to, if they have the class of primary, it's going to remove the class of primary. And if they don't have the class of primary, then it'll add it to them. So let's actually, I'll add primary to two of them beforehand. So when they load on the page, they'll have primary. And then this toggle class will run and switch their classes. And then whenever I click the button, I'll either be removing or adding it. Does that make sense?
Well, I just switching the class from primary.
What was that? Scott, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering why does switching the class from primary make it not display? Is that a jQuery pre-written sort of thing? Like I would think.
No, that's because
Oh,
when I first load them on the page, they don't have any background color, and I'm giving them background colors. I had some other classes like we could make it toggle this other class instead, second, and it'll just change the colors.
okay, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Regarding syntax, when you're calling classes, the first one's got a dot in front and the second one doesn't. Is that just how it goes?
So when you're targeting them, you're going to use them the same as CSS selectors, but the actual action you're doing, I think that there are some jQuery methods that do require you to use like a dot or an ID. But because this, anyone that says class, like I think actually, let's check this out. I think I might be able to say toggle and then do dot primary. So the method doesn't specify class, but I'm passing in a class selector. See if that works. Oh, that did not work. But in any case, if the function specifies class, then you don't need to use the dot to tell jQuery it's a class that you're trying to add.
Okay.
Can I have a look on what is written in the primary class in the .css file?
Yeah.
So that okay.
So
that that's what
this
create the square.
say that one more time.
That's what create. I mean, those ones, the two lines that are written in the primary class, they're the ones that create squares. That create squares on the once you create you click on the button, right?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. So those divs. Let's take out that line. So when I load the page, I have a class of content that's I have a class of content that's giving them size, but they don't have a border or a background color. And when I add primary, it's adding both a border and a background color.
Cool. Now I understand.
Cool. Alrighty. I think on that note, I will go ahead and end the screen share, and I will let everyone go to get into pairs and start the exercises. Nissa, what time are we going to be back later?
We'll plan on meeting up at 11:45 just for a quick Q&A and prep for the weekend. But otherwise, we'll give you the next 2 hours to work.
Cool. Sounds good.